Thanks again to Shauna and the Áras O'Connell for the invitation to speak here tonight. In late January 1966, having just led the Transport Workers Union in the first total shutdown of New York's subway, trains and buses, Mike Quill, the 60-year-old leader of TWU, died following a heart attack. In the aftermath of his death, one of the most notable tributes paid to Quill came from the Reverend Martin Luther King, who described the Kerry native as a man the ages will remember. King, who'd addressed the TWU's convention a few years previously, recalled Quill as a fighter for decent things all his life: Irish independence, labour organisation and racial equality. 30 years ago, a leader who was worried about his image and measured his popularity carefully kept his silence in order to keep his image popular. Negroes desperately needed men like Mike Quill, who fiercely said what was true, even when it offended. That's why Negroes shall miss Mike Quill. Indeed, from its inception in April 1934, the TWU Constitution had stressed that it welcomed all workers, regardless of race, creed, colour or nationality. By the time of his death, Quill had been active in US labour politics for nearly 40 years. Though his career began in the turbulent 30s, in an era of workplace militancy and expansion, Quill remained one of the more visible union personalities in America, even in less dramatic later decades. Indeed, during the 1950s, when US labour leaders were becoming ever more bland and non-confrontational, the flamboyant Quill was a favoured guest on television interviews and a regular source of colourful quotes for the press. In fact, Quill's final act as TWU leader was to paralyse New York with an all-out strike in early 1966. Clashing bitterly with the city's mayor, John Lindsay, Quill brought all his rhetorical power into play as he denounced the Republican Lindsay as strictly silk-stocking and Yale, a pipsqueak. Defying anti-strike legislation and refusing to obey a court injunction, Quill declared that the judge can drop dead in his black robes and we would not call off this strike. He also asserted that while some union bosses had become Labour statesmen, we're Labour leaders now. It's about time that someone, somewhere along the road, ceases to be respectable. Quill led the 12-day strike to a successful conclusion, gaining a 15% wage increase, the highest in the union's history. But he collapsed of a heart attack after being arrested on the 4th of January and died 3 weeks later. In February 2018, an article on the Irish Central website asked if Quill was America's greatest Irish-born hero, describing the Kerry man as a unique combination of revolutionary Michael Collins and Barry Fitzgerald, the Oscar-winning Irish actor. The article's author, Dermot McAvoy, noted how Quill's Irish revolutionary experience had shaped him. He said he'd fought the Black and Tans back home in his native county Kerry, and he fought the Free State Army during the Irish Civil War. And he had come to New York and fought the thugs the transit bosses used to terrorise subway workers to keep them in their place. Most contemporary profiles, sympathetic and hostile alike, similarly referenced Quill's Republican past. In 1948, Harper's Magazine described him as a bucko boy, loud, vigorous, forceful. All his life he's been involved in agitation. He'd grown up during the repressions, watching various members of his family being carted off to British jails by the Black and Tans. At the age of 15, he carried a rifle in a brigade of the Irish Republican Army. Indeed, as late as 1939, the FBI believed that Quill was still a member of the IRA. But the heyday of Quill's influence really came during the 1930s and 1940s, when he was both a union leader and a popular politician. Elected first as a New York City councilman in 1937, Quill was one of the main vote-getters for the American Labour Party over the next decade, topping the poll in the Bronx in 1943. He became a prominent figure in the new Congress of Industrial Organizations, the dynamic alternative to the craft-dominated American Federation of Labour, ultimately becoming CIO Vice President, as the TWU expanded to become a national union during the 1940s. During 1944, the FBI even speculated on Quill becoming the dominant Irish political figure in New York. Irish diplomats noted too that Quill was an extremely powerful figure in the labour movement. Significantly, however, they also suggested that as he was well known to have communist sympathies, the Kerry man was not acceptable to many Irish Americans. That Quill was popularly known as Red Mike, and as the New York Journal American put it during 1946, was the pro-communist and swaggering, boastful left-wing councilman of the radical CIO, is sometimes elided in modern accounts of his life. If his communist politics are mentioned, then they are explained as being purely pragmatic, embracing the old adage that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Irish Central Tribune asserted that Quill had a dim view of the communists and knew he wanted no part of them. Mike Quill would be indoctrinated by nobody. But the reality of Quill's relationship with communism and how this was negotiated within the Irish community is more complicated, as was his Irish republicanism. Now, the most complete account of Quill's career and TWU is a book by Joshua B. Freeman called In Transit. And there's also a very entertaining memoir by Quill's second wife called Mike Quill himself by Shirley Quill that's worth reading as well. But Quill himself was born in South Kerry. He was born near Gortlochray, which is in the district of Kilgarvan, in September 1905, one of 8 children. And he grew up in a farming family. Along with his brothers Daniel, John and Patrick, he was a member of the Kilgarvan Company of the IRA, though he was only 15 when the truce took place in July 1921. He may have played more of a role on the anti-treaty side in the Civil War, though he never claimed a military service pension, unlike a couple of his brothers. Certainly his brothers took part in the attack on Kinmare in September 1922. His genuine IRA record was sometimes exaggerated by supporters in New York, at least some of whom believed that his bad hip was the result of a British bullet. Quill himself said it was from an injury sustained while in hiding from Free State soldiers. After several years on the farm, Quill emigrated to New York, where his brothers John and Patrick and several cousins already lived, arriving in March 1926. He initially worked in construction and then as a travelling salesman before becoming a subway change checker with the Interborough Rapid Transit Company, then one of several private companies, another of the largest being the Brooklyn Manhattan Transit Company that ran New York's public transport system. All these companies had reputations for paternalistic but autocratic managements and largely passive company unions. They also had disproportionately Irish workforces, perhaps as high as 50% in some sectors being Irish-born men. That's not including Irish Americans. Many of the management and supervisors were also Irish, as were some of the hated private security men, the so-called beakies. So lots of transit workers were also neighbours who lived in the same Irish districts, who met each other at mass or at social events, often at one of the dozens of dance halls around which Irish social life in the city revolved. And this became important later on when the union was being organised. Many of the Irish fraternal associations, like the various county associations or the Ancient Order of Hibernians, had large transit worker memberships as well. But in general, the mainstream Irish American community and the Catholic Church displayed little interest in the conditions that transit workers laboured under, and neither did the often Irish-led or dominated craft unions. Now, Quill had much in common with most of his fellow Irish immigrants. The Quills were among the over 100,000 Irish people who emigrated to the US between 1921 and 1930. And most of these immigrants came, like them, from rural backgrounds. And again, it can be sometimes forgotten what a difference arriving in New York meant to Irish people from the countryside. Gortlochray had a population of 46 and the wider Kilgarvan district just under 3,000 people. In Kilgarvan, there were just 88 Protestants, and aside from a handful of elderly Irish speakers, just English spoken. Quill now travelled to a city of over 5 million people, where almost 40 languages could be heard, and where over half the population, nearly 3 million people, were foreign-born. Another 2 million New Yorkers were the children of foreigners. The city was divided by ethnic and multi-ethnic neighbourhoods. Perhaps the only similarity with rural Kerry was that Protestants were also a minority in New York. Almost 80% of New Yorkers were Catholics or Jews, a factor that contributed to the city's exceptionality, with its population outsiders in a country in which white Protestants controlled the most important levers of power and wealth. In 1931, the largest single ethnic group in the city was Italian, followed by Eastern European Jews, although there was a wider Jewish population who had come from elsewhere, then Germans, and then the Irish, with a growing African American population and also a population of West Indian immigrants too. For the newly arrived immigrant, no matter where they came from, this setting could be overwhelming, and many sought security amongst their own nationality. The city's Irish population in 1931 was estimated at just over 600,000, with 100,000 of them actually born in Ireland. Quill, like many immigrants, already had a family member living in a distinctly Irish neighbourhood. sometimes in Upper Manhattan, in other places on Manhattan's west side, neighbourhoods also in the Bronx, of course, and in Brooklyn and in Queens. And while some of these neighbourhoods were predominantly Irish, they were often shared with other ethnic groups, such as Italians in Greenwich Village, Germans in Yorkville, or Jews in Washington Heights or the South Bronx. Many Irish immigrants, particularly recent immigrants, gravitated towards work in construction, dock work, domestic service if they were women, or public transit. So he had something in common with a lot of his fellow immigrants. But him and his brothers were also part of a distinctive subgroup among this generation, that is anti-treaty IRA veterans. The IRA had seen heavy emigration from its members after the Civil War, particularly again from the west of Ireland. And there were as many reasons for their emigration as there were for non-political immigrants. Some certainly left the Free State because of political persecution. During 1926, the IRA sought employment in America for a number of teachers and civil servants that were denied work because of their politics. But others left for much the same reason that their neighbours did. And the majority of them did not become involved in politics in the United States. They left politics behind when they left Ireland. And Irish Republican politics in the 1920s, anyway, were a far cry from the great years between 1917 and 1921, when millions had joined support organisations like the Friends of Irish Freedom or the American Association for the Recognition of the Irish Republic. The Civil War had an enormously demoralising effect on Irish America, and there was widespread Irish American support for the treaty, even in nominally anti-treaty organisations. So all these organisations are a shadow of what they'd been a decade previously. The Clan na Gael, which is the most important support organisation for the IRA, had just 5,000 members in the US by 1927. Also, as an organisation composed in their own words of mostly poor men, its fundraising capacity was effectively ended by the Great Depression. So one thing that the IRA in Ireland complains about a lot in the early 30s is that there's almost no money coming from America. And the Clan na Gael say that's because none of our members have any money to send to you. But it would be true the Clan na Gael that several key figures in the story of the Transport Workers Union would first meet. Now, as a Kerry man, Quill became involved with the Clan's Austin Stack Club. At Clan events in Tara Hall on West 66th Street, he met a man called Gerald O'Reilly, who worked as a conductor on the IRT, the Interborough Rapid Transit. From Drogheda, O'Reilly had joined the IRA during 1919 and had remained active in the years after the Civil War before emigrating. Another important figure was Tom O'Shea, an East Cork man with an extensive IRA record, who worked as a turnstile mechanic. Other ex-IRA members such as Michael Lynch also worked for the IRT. Gerald O'Reilly recalled that following our meetings in Tara Hall, we would often go to a restaurant and have coffee and discuss incidents in Ireland, conditions on the job, a good place for rooms or digs. On one particular occasion, Mike Quill and Michael Lynch mentioned the possibility of organising a union. And the small number of IRA veterans, around 24 involved, were important for a number of reasons. They became really the core group involved in organising the TWU initially. Firstly, they were not easily intimidated by company strongmen or police. They were used to clandestine organising, and they also had the kudos of having come from Ireland, having taken part in the struggle against the British and the Free State. But O'Reilly was not just an anti-treatyite. Mirroring developments in Republican politics back home, some Clan members had embraced socialist politics by the late 1920s. The Clan's James Connolly Club contributed funds not only to the IRA, but also to striking workers, and urged Republicans to support those fighting to overthrow the capitalistic system. Charles McGinnity, who was a native of Armagh, ran the Clan na Gael Library, and he made sure that James Connolly's writings were available there. Connolly's works were to be very influential among the group that formed TWU. Quill referenced the Axe to the Root as particularly significant in terms of how they thought about the idea of this union. This is also reflected, of course, in the union's title. It's the Transport Workers Union, which comes from the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, rather than the Transit Workers Union, which would be the American norm. It's the Irish term they use. From the late 30s, the union has also held every year a Connolly commemoration, which it does to the present day and reflects that legacy. Quill, O'Reilly and McGinnity also joined the Irish Workers' Clubs when they were established in New York in 1932 by James Gralton, among others, as part of an attempt really by the Communist Party of the USA to influence Irish workers. So O'Reilly later asserted that the TWU had its roots principally in the Clonagale and IRA clubs, and secondly in the Irish workers' clubs. James Connolly gave us our inspiration, Mike Quill gave us our leadership. The Communist Party gave us the financial help and the trained organisers to put us on the road to success. O'Reilly also claimed that when a small group of us, many of whom were members of both organisations, the Clon and the workers' clubs, undertook to build a union, we sought help from different sources. Only one responded favourably, the Communist Party, which Mike and I and many other founding members subsequently joined. To aid the formation of this new union, the Communist Party assigned Harry Satcher as a lawyer, Maurice Forge as editor of our bulletin, Leo Rosenthal to run the mimeograph machine, also John Santo and Austin DeLockery. All these individuals who didn't work for the IRT could work openly at shops, shopgate meetings, at terminals, bus depots and so on. And all this was paid for by the Communist Party. Now, Austin DeLockery was a native of Clare who'd been in the anti-treaty Fianna Éireann during the Civil War. He'd arrived in New York during 1925 and ultimately studied at Columbia University and qualified as a civil engineer. For Communist Party work, he adopted the pseudonym Hogan, and that was how most transport workers knew him, as Austin Hogan. And he was the most important link between the IRA group and the communists. The transit workers also met Communist Party leaders Bill Dunn and William Z. Foster, who were both of Irish extraction, who were both knowledgeable about Irish history and had long-standing experience of industrial organisation. Ultimately, the TWU was launched then in April 1934 with Tom O'Shea as its first president. But Quill, a natural orator and sociable personality, quickly assumed a leading public role. When the union began holding open-air meetings on Friday evenings outside depots in largely Irish districts, Quill came into his own as a speaker. He had both the energy, wit and ability to put others at ease and the talent of being able to ridicule those in authority. So in December 1935, Quill replaced O'Shea as president of TWU Local 100, which is the New York branch of the union, the initial branch of the union in the 30s. By 1936, the union had established a solid presence on the IRT and was expanding into the other transit companies. Affiliating to the newly formed Congress of Industrial Organisations in 1937, by that year it organised 30,000 workers in the various New York transit lines and was expanding into the buses and trolleys and so on. Now, this was done in the teeth of often violent opposition, both physical violence from company security and strikebreakers, and also particularly references again and again to the union's links to communism. These accusations of communist influence came from several quarters. In 1936, rival unions alleged that Quill and other TWU officials were communists. A number of former Clon members would also later claim communist manipulation. Tom O'Shea broke with the union, and he later asserted in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee that he'd resigned as president on the orders of the Communist Party so Quill could become the new leader. Now, within the union, it was alleged that O'Shea and others left because they favoured using guerrilla tactics, essentially, in New York, blowing up subway stations and shooting strikebreakers, and that this wasn't acceptable. But obviously this is part of a split in which accusations flew back and forth. More broadly, many observers in New York wondered how a union in which more than 80% of the members were Catholics and therefore presumably anti-communists could be led by Communist Party members. The TWU was a source of great irritation, particularly to the Irish American right. The Brooklyn-based Father Edward Lodge Curran, who was editor of an influential paper, The Brooklyn Tablet, a contributor to the Gaelic American and a supporter of Father Charles Coughlin, the hugely popular radio priest as he was known at the time, was a particularly virulent critic of Quill and TWU. And he helped organise the American Association Against Communism, which tried to organise essentially rival bodies within the transit industry to counter TWU. Now, in that same period in the late 30s, the FBI were told by an informer that Quill was not a party member, but was near to the CP and followed the party line in every respect. Ultimately, in 1940, Quill was forced to give testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committees, chaired by the Texas Democrat Martin Dies. And here, several ex-TWU activists, including O'Shea, testified that Quill, Hogan and Santo were communists. Now, Quill denied being a communist. He denied membership of the CP. But he pointedly chose not to join the parade of red baiters for whom all workers have nothing but contempt. He famously stated that he would rather be called a red by the rats than a rat by the reds. Quill declared that if Dease is interested in routing isms, he should go back to Texas, where people are menaced by a dangerous ism, virtual nudism, because they don't have enough to eat and clothe themselves. Quill also told a mine workers' conference that there are many isms nowadays, from nudism to rheumatism, but my ism that gives the worker a chance to hold his job and keep his health is a good ism, and it's a better Americanism than anything done by the bosses. And this was kind of typical of Quill's rhetorical answers to claims of communist manipulation. The reality was, though, while his opponents were sure Quill was a communist, in the atmosphere of the late New Deal and with the emergence of the CIO as a national force, this accusation was far less damaging than it would become in later decades. Even more importantly, Quill was a highly effective leader. His union succeeded in gaining wage increases and benefits along with reductions in working hours. For union members then, personal popularity and skill at handling grievances and other problems generally counted more than ideology. One historian has suggested that Quill's popularity enabled him to deflect the red baiting. He and his colleagues denied their political affiliation, eschewed radicalism and concentrated on union business. Maurice Forge, who was a communist, summed up the membership's view as being, maybe they're Reds and maybe they're not, but they're nice guys and they bring home the bacon, so I shrug my shoulders, I go home and I sleep well. It's not true, however, to say that Quill and his allies eschewed radicalism. On a number of issues, they took stands that challenged their union membership and actually caused them great difficulty within the wider Irish community. The first was race. Historically, black workers were confined to the lowest rungs of the workplace ladder in the transit industry. But the first TWU executive in 1934 included Clarence King, an African-American porter. He was soon joined on the executive by two other black workers, Hislop Erkels and Lewis Manning. The union's office staff included black workers, as did the union's lady auxiliary, and all union events, including dances and sports days, were integrated from the beginning. The union affiliated to the National Negro Congress and to various anti-racist campaigns, and it also took a position on equal pay and promotion for African American workers as well. Now, this was hugely controversial and simply wasn't accepted by many of the membership. And indeed, what's interesting, of course, and it says something about the way that racism works, is that some members were prepared to accept the theory that blacks might be paid the same as white workers, but they were absolutely against black workers being allowed to attend dances and social occasions with white workers. So this was a recurring theme in the union's bulletins and in their work in the late 30s. The union also emerged in a very troubled time for Irish New Yorkers in particular. Though it mightn't have seemed obvious to a young working class emigrant, the Irish had been dominant in many aspects of the city's political and cultural life for a generation. Talking about the early 1900s, one historian has asserted that the Irish ruled New York. They controlled its government and politics, dominated construction and building, moved into the professions and managerial classes, and benefited perhaps disproportionately from the general prosperity of the times, that is the early 1900s. And certainly in terms of the craft unions, in terms of the police force, in terms of the Democratic Party, the Irish were extremely powerful. But for long periods, Irish cohesion had been maintained by keeping other ethnic and racial groups out of their areas of operation. Indeed, it was noted of the New York Irish that despite residing in one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world, Irish Americans could exhibit strikingly parochial worldviews. The post-war upsurge in anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic nativism after 1918, culminating in the humiliating defeat of Al Smith, who was not only a Catholic but seen by the Irish as one of their own in the presidential election of 1928, followed by the economic collapse of 1929 and the Great Depression, introduced a new insecurity which seems to have affected the Irish in New York particularly badly, as did the perceived challenge to their position by newer immigrants and immigrants who arrived after them. So at one Irish Republican meeting in New York in the late 1930s, one delegate complained that the Jews and the Italians are walking away with everything in town and we are a forgotten race. And you hear this said again and again in the Irish newspapers and so on at the time. And these resentments were most graphically displayed in Irish support for Father Charles Coughlin and in political and physical conflicts with Jewish New Yorkers in the late 30s. On global issues such as the war in Spain, there were sharp divergences between the Irish and Jewish communities in the city. Charles Coughlin, Father Coughlin, whose radio listenership numbered millions, received very favourable coverage in New York's Irish press, and the organisations that supported him, such as the Christian Front, were initially at least heavily Irish in makeup. Coughlin, himself very influenced by the writings of another Irish priest, Father Dennis Fahey, had moved from being a supporter of Roosevelt's New Deal in the early 30s to anti-Semitic demagoguery and ultimately to a defence of the Nazis by the late 30s. But in 1937, Mike Quill had asserted that the key lesson of his American experience had been learning that if black and white, Catholic and non-Catholic, Jew and Gentile are good enough to slave and sweat together, then they are good enough to unite and fight together. The right responded by alleging that the man they called Mo Kolwinski and his union were Jewish-controlled. During June 1939, Coughlin supporters in the South Bronx disrupted a TWU rally at which Quill was speaking, and there were clashes between his supporters and the Christian Front. Quill attacked what he called Irish fascists for exploiting patriotism to enlist support for the spoilers of Guernica in 1937. In contrast, his critics in the old IRA Association celebrated the success of the Christian Crusade in Spain. During 1940, the FBI reported that Quill is an ardent anti-Nazi and has freely furnished his support on numerous occasions to organisations participating in this work. He has been a frequent supporter at meetings denouncing the Nazi government of Germany and its activities. And this again was not uncontroversial at all. During 1939, the Clonnagael leader, Joe McGarrity, criticised Quill in a letter to Sean Russell, the IRA's leader, for taking part in one such protest. McGarrity noted how yesterday's New York papers gave an account of a parade held in New York Saturday, a Stop Hitler March, in which Mr. Quill was one of the speakers. Apparently he is a supporter of the English democracy. He took a rap at Father Coughlin. Some parader carried a placard bearing the following inscription: "Ireland stands united against Nazi oppression." That was Mr. Quill's and possibly Padre O'Donnell's contribution to the parade. Padre O'Donnell had spoken at the T.W. Connolly commemoration that year, where he'd warned of the influence of anti-Semitism among Irish workers in New York. He'd also attended the meeting in the South Bronx, where some Coughlin supporters involved in the disruption had told O'Donnell that they were in fact genuine Irish patriots and that Quill and his supporters had betrayed Ireland by their political affiliation. And this interethnic and political tension simmered throughout the war years. Nevertheless, through a network of former Clan and IRA members in the Transport Workers Union, Quill and O'Reilly established an American Labour Party presence in the South Bronx, which provided a counterweight to the Coughlinite support among the Irish there. And in fact, Quill topped the poll in 1943 in an election in the Bronx. The IRA in Ireland had also noted that when Quill visited here during 1937, during which he got married to Molly O'Neill from Cahersaveen, that he'd spoken to Labour Party meetings in Dublin and in Cork. He'd also privately met some of those who were about to leave to fight on the Republican side in Spain. But despite these differences, there is also evidence that Quill and Gerald O'Reilly helped aid Sean Russell's clandestine departure from the United States during April 1940. Russell was essentially on the run at the time from the FBI, and it was trade union contacts that got him out of America, which may indeed be a case of being able to hate the sin but being partial to the sinner, which is not unknown in Irish republicanism or in Irish life more generally. But Quill's anti-fascism was complicated by his ties to the Communist Party, especially after September 1939 and the Nazi-Soviet Pact. When he was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee in the spring of 1940, the Congressman Dyes tried to pin Quill down on his view of this pact. But Quill asserted that he was not expressing ideas on European pacts. The more American people kept out of Europe, the better. While the Communist Party's position had been highly controversial after September 1939 on the broader left, it actually allowed Quill to revert to a more traditional nationalist stance among the Irish community. Indeed, the party's new anti-British policy may have been more popular than its early anti-fascist stance among some TWU members. Some of Quill's enemies, including Father Curran, were also, of course, now loudly also supporting Irish neutrality. But the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Nazis brought another change. The September 1941 TWU convention, backed President Roosevelt's foreign policy and defence programme. Quill also told delegates to the convention that despite Hitler's crushing of Poland, France, Czechoslovakia and elsewhere, there were some Irish people who thought he'll be different when he comes to Ireland. They say he likes Ireland and that he'll give the Irish people a 32-county republic. Let no man or woman make any mistake about what Hitler will do when he gets to Ireland. Let us remember what he did to Holland and to Norway. He continued, but some say the English are a bad lot, just as bad as Hitler. But those who say that should draw a line between British rulers and British workers. The following month, the TWU Bulletin published a cable which had been sent to Joseph Stalin by Father Francis E. McMahon of Notre Dame, who claimed that millions of Americans of Irish descent have witnessed with admiration the struggle of the Russian people to preserve the life and soul of their country against Nazi aggression. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the Transport Union declared that events have abolished all debates. The hour for action is here. Over 5,000 members of the New York Local 100 alone served in the US military, and 76 were killed. Among those serving were Austin Hogan, who became a captain in the US Army and was badly wounded in the Pacific, and John Santo. And there was also then another reorientation on Irish politics. While respecting the Free State's right to neutrality, Quill stressed that it was vital that they also support the Allied cause. So the 1943 Connolly commemoration saw TWU members call upon our brothers and sisters in Ireland to make a vigorous and forthright stand against the fascist enemies of all mankind, to strengthen the bonds of the Friends of Ireland in America and in all United Nations by joining actively in the fight for world freedom and democracy. However, they also stressed that the British government should, as a means to assure victory over the Axis, grant immediate and complete independence to Ireland. In December 1943, Quill initiated a Justice for Ireland campaign. He asked that how can any small nation fight for freedom when one hand is tied behind its back? As long as Ireland is cursed with two governments and partition, it cannot have an opportunity to do its part fully. And he argued that a commitment by the Allies that partition would be removed following Hitler's defeat would be a powerful impetus towards allowing the 26 counties to enter the war on the Allied side. And 250,000 copies of Quill's speech were distributed in pamphlet form in the United States. Though the government in Dublin again noted that his communist links made many Irish American organisations very wary of endorsing his call. The 1944 Congress of Industrial Organisations Convention passed a Quill-inspired resolution asking the Allies to help restore the geographical and political integrity of Ireland by granting her a place at a post-war peace conference. Now, Quill's tightrope here was, of course, that he was formally supporting Irish neutrality, but saying that Ireland could enter the war if partition was ended and the British granted complete freedom to Ireland. During 1944, the Fianna Fáil TD and, of course, legendary IRA figure Dan Breen denounced Quill as a mischief maker and warned him to keep his nose out of Irish affairs. Quill replied that while he agreed with Breen that Britain was historically responsible for Ireland's misfortunes, he said, there are now many Irish politicians who would drop dead the day Ireland became free, as they would have no more slogans to dangle before the people in order that a few incompetents can maintain themselves in soft jobs. And he was, again, rhetorically quite critical of the Irish political scene at this point. But the politics of the war intervened dramatically again in Quill's relationship with the Irish community in May 1945. He angrily denounced De Valera for having, in Quill's words, plodded his way to the Nazi legation in Dublin to publicly shed tears over the death of Adolf Hitler. He claimed that this dastardly act was an insult to the sons and daughters of the Irish in exile, especially those fighting for decency, freedom and democracy. Quill charged that neutrality was no excuse for De Valera dragging Ireland into a corroded Nazi cesspool. The article in the Transport Union Bulletin was accompanied by a photograph of corpses piled high in a recently liberated Nazi death camp, and copies were widely distributed in the US and abroad and also sent to Ireland itself. Now, while Irish diplomats called what Irish diplomats called this venomous attack did not go unnoticed in Ireland, it has to be said. It didn't get a huge amount of publicity, really, and there was quite strong censorship as well. The strongest reactions to the statement came in America, and particularly in New York. Now, in reality, what Quill said about De Valera actually reflected quite a widespread mood among Irish Americans, and there's dozens of letters sent to De Valera personally from Irish Americans attacking him over the visit to the legation. But it met with a ferocious backlash against Quill in New York. Over the next month, the Irish press in the city carried reports of a mighty wave of protest. Quill was condemned by the United Irish Counties Association, by numerous individual counties associations, including the Kerry men, by the Gaelic Athletic Association, by the Old IRA Association, by the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and also by the Association of Catholic Trade Unionists. The Gaelic American described Quill as a fellow traveller of the Stalins and others of the communistic tribe, the favoured statesman of the daily worker, and the darling of the assorted Reds. He was accused of crucifying De Valera for the Kremlin's sake. Now, for some, the episode offered opportunity to settle old scores, with Father Curran again loud in his denunciations of Quill. But Quill also quickly realised that the attack on De Valera had not only enraged right-wingers, but actually Irish organisations more broadly, who were very defensive about De Valera's reputation. He responded then that as far as some of his critics were concerned, he was happy to throw their comments back into their fascist faces. However, he also acknowledged that hundreds of honest, well-meaning Irish nationalists had strongly criticised his article. Many of these people, he conceded, were excellent trade union members whose sincerity he respected. So he was aware that he'd essentially overstepped, certainly rhetorically, the line with some of his union members. So that's May 1945. Within 3 years, Red Mike was no more, at least in the sense of his relationship with the Communist Party. In 1948, Quill broke publicly and acrimoniously with the party and with old comrades like Hogan and O'Reilly. The immediate issue was the raising of the subway fare from a nickel to 10 cents. Quill was prepared to accept this in return for a wage increase for his members, but the Communist Party, mindful of its community base in places like the Bronx and Brooklyn, demanded that the fare be retained. Another issue was the Communist Party's demand that the union support the Progressive Party's Henry Wallace in his bid for the presidency in the 1948 elections. Quill felt this would tear apart the Congress of Industrial Organisations and would needlessly weaken the unions. In March 1948, Quill publicly told 2,000 TWU members at the Manhattan Centre that he was through with the communists and the crackpots. At the climax of his speech, he seized a copy of the Daily Worker and ripped it up, shouting, "That's what I think of them." In later years, Quill's allies portrayed this as an expression of independence by a man sick of manipulation. But the reality was, as ever, a bit more complicated. Quill had seen how anti-communism had been used by rival unions to weaken the TWU in Miami, and how the national mood was shifting in regard to Russia and to communism more generally. Quill wrote to both William Z. Foster of the Communist Party and to the Italian communist leader Luigi Longo in early 1948, warning that CP policy would split the unions, weaken our position locally and weaken our position both locally and nationally against the employers. But he also stressed to them that he would not join the camp of professional communist haters and warmongers. Ultimately, however, not only did he publicly denounce the party, he privately aided attempts by CIO leader Philip Murray to purge other unions of CP leaders, providing information on communist strategies over the previous decade. He also defeated his former allies within the Transport Workers Union, isolating and then forcing Hogan, O'Reilly and others out. Hogan challenged Quill for the TWU leadership and lost after a bitter struggle. After 1950, Hogan returned to his work as an engineer and later retired to Ireland in poor health, and he died here in 1974. Now, the battle was one Quill was always likely to win, because despite the key role communists had played in the foundation of the union, they had on numerous occasions denied that they were communists in the first place. How then could they effectively counter Quill when he minimised their role or accused them of duplicity? In the New Deal era, Quill's wisecracks about nudism allayed fears among the rank and file about their leadership. Even during the 1930s, however, one leading CP industrial organiser had recognised that concealing our identity deliberately breeds mistrust among workers. They cannot understand why we are ashamed, why we hide the fact that we are communists. A small number of transport union members were dedicated anti-communists. A few of them were fascists, sometimes with backgrounds in a Catholic Labour milieu. Another small group within the union were communists or were pretty sympathetic to the party, but most, in the words of Maurice Forge, were complacent, and the communists were content with this while it benefited them. But the subterfuge inherent in the CP's culture made them sitting ducks essentially in the new situation of the Cold War, with the US and the Soviet Union now deadly enemies and communists the domestic representatives of that enemy. And again, there's such a huge cultural change from the war years to the late 40s in the US, where Stalin goes from being, one of the key figures helping defeat Hitler to being essentially the devil incarnate. That this is, quite a massive transformation that you can't really, at times, the scale of it is huge. But Quill recognised that. He also recognised that the communist secrecy simply reinforced the negative image fostered by the party's enemies. Quill's own persona and skill made it possible for him to navigate this, ultimately by the late 40s in ways that pandered to the anti-communism of much of his membership. Nevertheless, within the much narrower political space of the 1950s, the TWU retained something of a radical edge. Quill opposed the CIO's merger with the American Federation of Labour in 1955, lamenting that after 20 years of struggle, we are marching back down the road to the AFL. Quill held that the older Union Federation was guilty of the 3 Rs: raiding, racketeering and racism. There was also a resolute endorsement of black civil rights from the 1950s onwards, and of the leadership of Martin Luther King, which was still very controversial for many Americans and indeed many Irish New Yorkers in the late 50s. The civil rights leader addressed the TWU convention in 1961, and his speech, in which he effusively praises Quill and his union, is accessible online, and it's very interesting in terms of, he obviously has quite a close relationship with Quill's union. 2 years later, King told Quill that you and members of your union have proved to be real and abiding friends of his movement. Quill was also an early sceptic about American intervention in Vietnam, noting in 1965 how the Vietnamese guerrilla fighters reminded him of the IRA of his youth. But it was a bit early to say he really opposed the Vietnam War, but certainly he was sceptical. Gerald O'Reilly, who subsequently left the Communist Party himself and then returned with Quill's backing to a position within the Transport Union, later suggested that Quill made the union and preached class struggle and socialism to the Irish by way of Connolly, which was no small thing in the 1930s when the Christian Front was strong in New York. And that in many ways is Quill's strongest legacy. In early 2017, John Samuelson, who was then president of TWU Local 100, was one of the most vocal union opponents of Donald Trump's Muslim ban, invoking his own family history of emigration and that of Quill, and asserting that the Transport Union was built by immigrants and refugees. And this message is again, I'm afraid, sadly relevant in the Ireland of 2024. And there's lots of things we can learn from Quill's complicated life, but his opposition to racism and to anti-Semitism and so on is something that he should be, and we should be proud of too. So I'll stop there. Thank you.